Yes. So our first question is there, and they are asking you, the Vienna settlement was bound to fail. Discuss. I'm aware this is one of the first topics. It is one of those very short topics. It is one of those very simple topics that is also very common, and you can ask the questions in many ways. So if you look at the Vienna settlement, three things you should learn in the Vienna settlement. One, you should learn the aims of the Vienna settlement, and then of course you need to know the achievements of the Vienna settlement or the positive impacts of the Vienna settlement. Then you need also to know the failures of the Vienna settlement. So once you know those three areas, then you have understood what the Vienna settlement was all about. And I hope people know that the Vienna settlement was an outcome of the Vienna Congress, where the Vienna Congress was the physical meeting that was attended by European peacemakers or European statesmen coming from different areas, of course, hosted by Metternich in his capital in Vienna. And then the outcome is what came to be known as the Vienna settlement. But before we go into the content that is required for this question, it's important for us to navigate through and see. So who represented the Austria? Which personality represented Austria during the Vienna settlement? Very fast. People who can, the different personalities who attended the Vienna Congress. We have Austria, of course, represented by Metternich himself. And then we had Prussia, represented by Frederick William. Then we had Britain, represented by Castoria. Then we had France, represented by Bishop Talleyrand. And then Russia, of course, represented by Tsar Alexander I. Those are the major parties during the Vienna settlement or the Vienna meeting. But there were other smaller states that also attended, much as their interests were not catered for at all. So the Vienna settlement ended, or let us say the Vienna settlement was concluded in 1815. And the question is telling us how the Vienna settlement was bound to fail. Discuss. So as a student, those are the things you're expected to do. Introduce the Vienna settlement like we have done, show how it was bound to fail on one side, and also show how it was bound not to fail on the other side. Meaning that the question is two-sided and it requires a standing point. So what are the things that made the Vienna settlement surely bound to fail, as we are going to see here? It is true that the Vienna settlement was concluded by the big European powers in 1815, following the Battle of Waterloo that led Napoleon's exile. And it was aimed at restoring peace, security, further French aggression, restoring legitimate rulers, redrawing the map of Europe, and restoration of legitimate rulers. You need to give some hint about the aims of the Vienna settlement before you go in and start showing how it was bound to fail. It was also meant to reward the victor powers and also punish the vanquished powers. Vanquished here means the powers that were defeated. The indemnity was imposed. The first point here is that the indemnity which was imposed on France was unfair. How much was France supposed to pay? 700 million francs. That was too much money. In fact, France had to negotiate for a reduction. That was during the regime of Louis XVIII. So France did not pay the whole amount. but that shows you that it was a huge amount of money. So that makes, that is one way the Vienna settlement was bound to fail, because of the huge war indemnity it imposed on France. Then the army of occupation that was also imposed on France was not liked by the French masses. Although this army was later withdrawn in 1818 when France paid the war indemnity, but because of that condition, the Vienna settlement was indeed bound to fail because of its unfair step that it took against France. Then look at the territorial adjustments that were made or that were carried out by the settlement. In other words, if you look at the way territories were shared, some countries or some states were left unhappy. For example, the small states were not considered in the process of sharing these territories. And that is partly also why they worked towards the failure of the Vienna settlement. In fact, if you look at on the other hand, I'm seeing Rita, your hand is up.
Teacher, my problem is with the question approach. Huh?
Yeah.
So, okay, our teacher told us a question can be two-sided if there is like a factor in question. So, so for this case, is the failure the okay? For me, when I first read it, I looked at it as if it was one-sided. But then, how does it come to be two-sided? Is the failing the factor, or I wanted you to explain more about it.
Let's go back to the question. Is there? The Vienna settlement was bound to fail. Discuss. Now, if you look at the Vienna settlement, that is like a quotation. And if you're going to answer this question and you're going to discuss how the Vienna settlement was bound to fail, it means it is proper for you to look at the other side of the question. In other words, the question is like asking you, the Vienna settlement was bound to fail. What do you say? You see that? So the proper approach to this question is, it is a two-sided question, because there is that part that tells you, give us your opinion. So you cannot only accept that the Vienna settlement was bound to fail, and yet you are aware that the Vienna settlement registered so many other achievements. So the right approach is that you have to show the other side. However, I know there are some questions that are set like this that only are one-sided. For example, if they tell you that the French Revolution was bound, okay, the Vienna, for example, if they say that the French Revolution was inevitable, discuss. Or the reign of terror was inevitable, discuss. Now, in that case, there is nothing else you can write on the other side. It's true they are showing you that the French Revolution was inevitable because they are asking for the factors that led to the ETZ outbreak. Or they're asking for the outbreak of the reign of terror if the question is rotating around the reign of terror. But if a question is here and it is asking you, for example, in this case, it's a settlement, and they're looking at the failures and they're giving you an option to discard the achievements. Rita, we are continuing. I thought you had something else to ask. All right, if you look at the restoration of legitimate rulers, the idea of restoring legitimate rulers, we are saying it was a bad idea. Bad idea because the legitimate rulers later became very despotic. For example, if you look at Spain, the ruler who was this restored there, by around 1820s, there were already trouble in Spain. In France, trouble started during the regime of Charles X. And so, with all these legitimate rulers who later became despotic, indeed, it means that the Vienna settlement made a mistake, and therefore it was bound to fail, indeed. Then the idea of rewarding the victor powers and punishing the vanquished powers was not fair, because even in the process of rewarding the victor powers, some powers were given the lion's share of the territories, and again placing the vanquished powers under the domination of the victor powers, it made them lose, or we can say it placed them under foreign domination that later led to revolutions, wars, and eventually these nationalities were able to get their independence, but it was not fair. So many people did not like that idea. So again, in that way, it meant that the Vienna settlement would collapse soon. Then if you look at the settlement imposed, right, let us continue. Something had happened here. The adjustments carried out by the settlement were unfair. Territorial adjustments, we talked about that. And then we have Britain's territorial gains were more economic than others. Britain gained so many territories that made her very strong. Britain, for example, gained at the Cape of Good Hope. Britain gained Malta and other territories. So in the process of sharing, I think Britain was given a chance to pick out the territories she wanted. And therefore, she ended up with very many territories that were economically viable. And that created bitterness even among the Vienna peacemakers. So it would make the outcome to collapse very, very fast. Then the settlement created imbalance of power. Imbalance of power here, we are talking about how some countries became very, very powerful after the Vienna settlement. For example, Britain and Austria, they gained a lot of territories, and therefore the balance of power that they talked about was not even there. So there was no perfect balance of power, and eventually the Vienna settlement surely had to collapse, and therefore that also shows that from the beginning, the Vienna settlement was bound to fail. Then if you look at this last point here, it ignored the principle of nationalism among the small nationalities or the small states. It is true that the small states or the weak states were shared like wedding cake by the Vienna peacemakers. If you look, for example, at the Italian states, you look at the German states that were placed under Austria, and Austria would rule them for a very long time. So in that case, they abused they ignored the need for independence and abused the interests of these people. And that later led to the growth of nationalism in those areas. Then also, the views of the small powers were neglected by the settlement, which caused the rebellion. Later, it is on record that the representative who came from Sweden, whereas he came to attend the meetings, it is said that the representative of Sweden was used as an entertainer. So they would only call him during commercial breaks to give his opinion and just for laughter. And that means that all other small states were not given a fair chance, much as they were in attendance. Many of them were kept out of the major discussions like children in Sunday school. So the discussions were dominated by the major four, that is Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The rest were only there attending but did not take part in the discussions. Then if you look at the Constitutional Charter of 1814 that was granted to France, whereas it was a very good step, but the Constitution had so many loopholes that made it very hard even for Louis XVIII and Charles X to use it to rule France. So looking at that constitution that was given to the rulers of France that had many loopholes, also in a way, it shows how short-lived the Vienna settlement would be. Then the settlement suffocated the Italian and German nationalities plus the Belgians. How? Because these three nationalities were placed under foreign domination. We all know how the Belgians were forced to unite with the Dutch to form the Netherlands Kingdom. And then also know that Germany and the German and the Italian states were placed under the domination of Austria. And that made it very, very hard for them to fight for their independence. And later it caused a lot of trouble. But later they got their independence, of course. Then we have the settlement promoted forceful amalgamation of states like Poland that was given to Russia by force, Belgium that was given to the Dutch by force. And this forceful amalgamation of states, it's important to remember that it caused revolutions. The 1830 revolutions in Belgium was caused by this forceful amalgamation. Also, the 1830 revolution in Russia was also caused by this forceful amalgamation of the people of Poland to Russia. So in that way, again, you see that indeed the Vienna settlement was going to be short-lived. Then the settlement ignored the Eastern question. The Eastern question here, we are saying that already Europe had a lot of interest in the East. We are talking about the Balkan region, where all European countries and states were carrying out trade. But whereas they were discussing European issues, they did not consider the issues in Turkey, and yet Turkey was part of them. So again, by neglecting the Eastern question, again, that meant that the Vienna settlement for sure would be short-lived because of their failure to consider issues in Turkey. Then the settlement was based on the ideas of Metternich as a person. Metternich was conservative. Metternich did not like the liberal forces. Metternich did not like revolutions. Metternich did not like France. And yet this settlement rotated around him. In fact, it is rumored that the settlement was perhaps drafted by Metternich. The venue was Metternich's own house. But also it's important to remember that Metternich dominated the discussions and made it all in his favor. So because of that, again, the Vienna settlement will surely stay for a short time. Then the settlement made short-looked and temporary decisions. It's important to remember that the European peacemakers did not have any experience, but also the outcomes of the Vienna settlement did not live for too long. Take, for example, the idea of having now a Congress system. That was good, but how long did the Congress system even stay? The Congress system only lasted for about 7 years, and then it collapsed completely. So that means that most of the outcomes of the Vienna settlement were temporary, and that clearly shows that the Vienna settlement indeed was going to be short-lived. And again, the Vienna settlement was laid on a weak foundation. For example, the Congress system, we all know it started in 1818 with the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle. And then the Congress system continued with a few other congresses that were held in Europe. And soon after that, the Congress system collapsed. And yet the Congress system was an outcome of the Vienna settlement. So those are the different ways upon which, or through which, the Vienna settlement was bound to fail. However, on the other hand, the Vienna settlement registered so many achievements, as you can see, well laid out here. I would like to ask if there's anybody who wants to explain these achievements of the Vienna settlement so that we move as one. Anybody who wants to take us through the achievements of the Vienna settlement so that we move? Yes, no one? Let me see, you have 8 participants here. Okay, so let us continue with the achievements of the Vienna settlement. As you can see, the settlement managed to contain further French aggression. We all know how France was a source of trouble and chaos in Europe before the Vienna settlement was concluded. During the regime of Napoleon, and even before that, during the period of the French Revolution, France was the source of chaos. So we are saying that the Vienna settlement managed to contain France, that was a source of aggression. Then it adopted and implemented the restoration of legitimate rulers. Well, as it is true that these legitimate rulers later became trouble causers, it is also important to recall that these legitimate rulers restored some degree of peace and stability in Europe. Then it restored relative peace in Europe. There was peace in Europe for about 40 years, specifically from 1815 up to around 1854. There was no major war between European powers. And therefore, we should credit the Vienna settlement for restoring peace in Europe for at least 40 years. When the Crimean War broke out in 1854, that's when the Europeans again experienced some chaos. So there was peace. The settlement led to the birth of diplomacy. In other words, for the first time in Europe, the European leaders accepted to sit down and discuss and agree on a few things that should be done in the interest of Europe. And soon after that, the Congress system was conceived, the idea of the Congress system was conceived, and the Congress system started in 1818, much as it collapsed too fast. But the truth is that it marked the beginning of diplomacy, and that was indeed a great achievement. Then the settlement granted Switzerland neutrality and independence. Switzerland was declared a neutral state during the Vienna settlement, and that means that Switzerland would be treated like Portugal, where no state is expected to intervene into the affairs of Switzerland, but also no state was expected to show aggression towards Switzerland. And that is one of the major achievements of the Vienna settlement. Then the settlement redrew and reorganized the map of Europe. The settlement redrew and reorganized the map of Europe, meaning that They tried to reduce the size of France to that of 1719, but also at the same time, they tried very much to ensure that France does not become a source of trouble again in Europe. So redrawing the map of Europe here means that certain states were given to others. In other words, the map of Europe did not remain the same after the Vienna settlement. For example, we saw the birth of the Netherlands Kingdom that wasn't there, and other territorial adjustments that were made. And then we are seeing here, it laid a foundation. It laid a foundation for the unification of Italy. Well, as it is true that the Vienna settlement placed the Italians and the Germans and Austria, but it is also true that it marked the beginning of revolutionary struggles among these two nationalities. So it helped the Italians and the Germans to fight for their independence. Then, of course, you know, the Vienna settlement eliminated Napoleon from the European affairs. It is the Vienna settlement that actually made Napoleon to be taken to the island of St. Helena. Unfortunately, he died in 1821, and his body was brought back for burial in France in 1841 after 20 years. But the most important thing is that it eliminated Napoleon from European politics, and it created some balance of power. Whereas it is true that the balance of power was not perfect, we also know that that balance of power, the idea of balance of power, was one of the aims, one of the objectives of the Vienna peacemakers. So the Vienna peace settlement restored the legitimate rulers, balance of power, peace, and all that. So after that, then you come and then give us your conclusion with your standpoint after looking at the different ways the Vienna settlement was bound to fail and looking at the achievements of the Vienna settlement. So you give us your conclusion and your standpoint. And by the way, your standpoint should also be within your introduction. For example, at that point, if you are answering this question, you write the introduction where you're going to tell us what was the Vienna settlement, who are the parties that were involved in the Vienna settlement, and then you give us your standpoint. So according to you, the Vienna settlement was bound to fail to a greater extent or to a smaller extent. Then when you're concluding again, you can give us your conclusion, and the conclusion should be the same, consistent with what you told us in the beginning. If you say the Vienna settlement was bound to fail to a greater extent, please reaffirm that in your conclusion by saying, indeed, the Vienna settlement was bound to fail to a greater extent as explained above. However, the Vienna settlement also registered very many achievements as explained above still. So that is what you are expected to do as you answer that question. If there's any question and you feel you need more clarification, please feel free to ask, because I don't want us to move and then people have questions that they are not asking. Any question so far? Is there any question? All right. It seems there isn't a question so far, so we can be moving. All right, so let me see. See Cyrus. Cyrus, good afternoon. Cyrus, I am asking you to unmute. Let me first come here. And then I see. Yes. Oh, this person. Oh, the feedback from silence is terrible. Okay, let me ask who's called Benko? Why 40? So Benko cannot be unmuted. Let me ask Olive. Olive, good afternoon. I want to give you a task. Are you there? Olive maybe isn't there. But anyway.
No, I'm there.
Okay. So I want you to read for me now what I'm sharing on the board on the screen. The question, are you in senior 6 Olive? Senior 6 Olive?
Yeah, senior 6.
Okay. So that topic you've covered, the Russian Revolution you've covered.
Which one?
Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
You've covered it. Yeah. Because number 2 is on the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, we covered it, but we used to just do notes, not explanation.
Okay. The good thing you are here today. The explanation should be clear now. Yeah. Anyway, the question is, how far did the external factors influence the downfall of Tsar Nicholas II in Russia in 1917? If you follow the history of the Russian rulers, who was the ruler before Tsar Nicholas II in Russia? The ruler before Tsar Nicholas II in Russia was Tsar Alexander II. And the ruler before Tsar Alexander II was Tsar Nicholas I. The ruler before Tsar Nicholas I was Tsar Alexander I. So you can see we had Tsar Alexander I, we had Tsar Nicholas I, we had Tsar Alexander II, then now we are having Tsar Nicholas II by 1917 in Russia. And the revolution broke out, and that revolution led to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. Maybe before we look at the factors, whether external or internal, and how it caused the downfall of Tsar Nicholas II in Russia, it's important for us to analyze a few of his policies. For example, we all know that Tsar Nicholas II was very despotic. We all know that Tsar Nicholas II managed to take Russia to the First World War. We all know that Tsar Nicholas II depended a lot on the advice of his wife, Alexandria, and the advice of his witch doctor, Grigory Rasputin. We also know that Tsar Nicholas II was very ruthless and he depended on the army. The army to do everything that he wanted. And we also know that Tsar Nicholas II was known for keeping the Russians very poor under very, very poor working conditions, and the Russians did not have land. And therefore, when the revolution broke out in 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown. He was overthrown by the 1917 revolution. After his overthrow, he escaped and he went to exile and he went to Siberia. Anyway, so the question is here. How far did external factors influence the downfall of Tsar Nicholas II in Russia in 1917? So that means that we are expected to look at external factors, all right, on one side, and then on the other side, other factors. That means that even in this case, a clear standpoint is required. A clear standpoint is necessary. So we have given a brief background of Tsar Nicholas II. We have given a brief background of Tsar Nicholas II. So let us now go and see which external factors led to the downfall of Tsar Nicholas II. Which ones are external factors that caused this man's downfall? For example, we said he took Russia to the First World War. Russia performed very badly in the First World War, and therefore the people of Russia were asking, why did Russia even join the First World War in the first place? So many people did not like him because of that idea. So one of the factors that actually led to his downfall was the participation of Russia in the First World War. And it's important to remember that Russia performed so poorly in the First World War. And that's partly why the revolution broke out. In fact, Russia was forced to withdraw her troops from the war when the revolution broke out. Then also we had that factor, the Russo-Japanese War. It is also one of the causes of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And it is important to remember that during that war, again, Russia performed poorly. That's why they say the impact of the Russo-Japanese War. For example, this made Russia to lose Port Arthur in the Treaty of Portsmouth after the defeat of Russia by Japan. So many people were not happy with Russia or happy with Tsar Nicholas Tsar Nicholas II, because of his poor policies that led to the loss of that port. Then you had the negative effect of World War I. I think I've explained that. The opposition from the Baltic provinces of Estonia, Latvia, Poland against the policy of the Tsar. What was this policy of Russification? The Russification policy, what was it about? Anybody who wants to answer? The policy of Russification by Russia, where Russia forced the Russian culture on most of the neighboring small territories of Estonia, of Poland, of those small states. So, because of that policy, many people did not like the Tsar with his policies, and therefore there was a resistance. And obviously, when the revolution broke out, the Tsar was defeated. Then you have the influence of Western liberal revolutionary ideas. So liberalism, constitutionalism, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, it's important to remember that the leaders of the Russian Revolution came from neighboring countries. You see, Joseph Stalin and his friend Lenin, they were in exile. They were in Germany. And before the revolution, they were smuggled in. And that shows you that indeed the downfall of the Tsar was planned from outside. And that makes it more of an external affair. Then you have the influence of Western liberal revolutionary ideas of that one we talked about already. German influence and propaganda, I've just talked about that. How Germany, in a way, planned the revolution and then brought in Lenin and Joseph Stalin to lead the revolution, and yet they were refugees the other side. So I have the influence of Germany as one of the causes of the downfall of the Tsar, and it was external. Yes. Is there a question? I'm hearing some noise in the background. Okay. All right, let us continue with the other factors that were responsible for the downfall of the Tsar. Here I will see his weak character. He accepted to be advised by his wife. Tsarina Alexandria was the most important advisor to the Tsar. And Tsarina also depended on the advice of the evil monk, Rasputin Grigory. And them together, they misled the Tsar because of his weak what? Weak character. He practiced despotism. Like I said in the beginning, he was an autocratic leader. He was despotic and he used a lot of force. And because of that, he attracted a lot of opposition, a lot of resistance, so much that by 1917, when the revolution broke out, there was no option but to abdicate. So the Tsar left the throne, trying to leave it in favor of his relative, who also cowardized, and his regime ended like that. He denied people freedom of worship. In Russia, most of the people are Orthodox Christians. But also we are aware that there are other religions or other religious groups that were not given freedom of worship. And because of that, over time, there was a lot of resistance that later led to the overthrow of the Tsar. Then see the influence of Tsarina Alexandria. We said she was like Marie Antoinette of some sort. She misled the king, she misled the Tsar by giving the Tsar wrong advice. For example, at some point, she advised the Tsar to dismiss very many of his ministers, and she influenced appointments of many of the ministers. So over time, many people discovered that the Tsar was making a lot of errors, largely because of the influence of Tsarina. But in the end, it caused the Tsar to be overthrown. Then in the policy of Russification, we have just talked about that. The policy of forcing the small, weak states around Russia to adopt the Russian culture. So many people did not want to accept the policy of the Tsar of forcing that forcing the Russian culture on these neighboring nationalities. Some, they supported the revolution, or they supported the removal of the dictator. Then how it dissolved the several Dumas to bring about desired reforms. The Duma was the Russian parliament. And we are saying here that the Tsar dissolved the Dumas. In other words, it dissolved the parliament in Russia. And so he ruled as a true absolute ruler, or as a true despot. And therefore, over time, the revolution broke out, and then his regime ended. Then the impact of the Red Bloody Sunday affair. We remember that in 1905, there was a peaceful demonstration that was led by an Orthodox priest called Father Gapon, and they were peacefully demonstrating against the unfair policies of the government. And unfortunately, the Tsar used the army to disperse the demonstrators, and many people were killed. So by 1917, many people were not happy with what happened in 1905. And therefore, that partly is why the Tsar was overthrown by the revolutionaries. Then his failure to listen to the demands of the middle class, the elites and the merchants. In any state, in any country, if you lose the favor of the merchants, the favor of the elites, the middle class, usually your government becomes very, very vulnerable. And therefore, when the Tsar ignored the interests of the merchants and the middle class people, it is true that when the revolution broke out, he was easily defeated. No wonder he abdicated the throne and he went to exile on his own. Then he also lost support of the army. It is true that the army mutinied several times when the Tsar was in power. It is true that the army struck many times when the Tsar was still in their leader. And that shows that the army was not happy. And including the Cossack regiment, that was the most disciplined section of the force. So eventually, the Tsar, because he lost favor of the army, he lost favor of the middle class, and he lost favor of many other groups of people, indeed he was overthrown. There is someone who is playing music instead. Okay. I think that is Olive. All right. We have the rise of personalities, people like Lenin, people like Stalin, people like Trotsky, people like Letrovsky, and other leaders of the Russian Revolution. Such personalities mobilized the people. Such personalities gave reason to people to revolt, and indeed, they capitalized on the weaknesses of the Tsar, and that is partly why the revolution broke out easily, that led to the downfall of the Tsar. Then you have the natural calamities like famine. There was drought. There was a severe food shortage that preceded the outbreak of the revolution. And therefore, by 1917, there was no option for the Tsar but to go. So as you can see, that the Russian Revolution was the turning point in the career of the Tsar. But as you have also seen that the downfall of the Tsar was partly caused by many external factors like we identified in the beginning. And then on the other hand, the downfall of the Tsar was partly caused by other factors, which are some of those other factors are his own internal policies. And some of the other factors are also his policies, his external policies or his foreign policies. For example, that policy of Russification, that partly caused his downfall, but it was his foreign policy. So that is for number 2. And then let me see number 3. What is in our number 3? Okay, number 3 is here. Account for number 3 is account. I'm looking for number 3, just a minute. Our number 3 is account for the success of the French Revolution. Account for the success of the French Revolution of 1789. We all know that the French Revolution succeeded in 1789. In France, the government was overthrown. The government of Louis the 16th was overthrown, and it changed very many things. Unfortunately, this bit is rarely taught. very few people have notes that can explain why the French Revolution succeeded. But we have other revolutions that we have gone through, and they have given us factors that led to the success of such a revolution. For example, they give us reasons why the Belgian Revolution succeeded. And then they also give us reasons why the Russian Revolution succeeded. And in 1848 revolutions, they give us reasons why the 1848 revolutions failed in some areas. And therefore, basing on that, we can borrow ideas. And then we'll be in position to answer this question. So is this question one-sided or two-sided? If I may ask people who are in here, what do you think?
It's one-sided.
It's one-sided. Very good. So the question is one-sided. The reasons are many, but let's see the factors that led to the success of the French Revolution of 1789. You can see there the weakness of the king himself, who also depended so much on the advice of the queen, who misled him most of the times. The king spent a lot of his time, valuable time, doing nothing but hunting in the royal gardens instead of concentrating on serious issues concerning France. The king himself, on many occasions, also depended on the advice of the clergy and the nobility, who also misled him. So we are saying the king made the revolution to succeed. I think you saw during the revolution how the king tried even to escape, to run away to Austria, showing that he was scared. So the king's own weakness is what caused the revolution to succeed. Perhaps if we had a serious king, a more focused king in France, maybe this revolution should have been contained. And perhaps the revolution wouldn't even have broken out if the king was foresighted. But because the king was so weak, the revolution inevitably broke out. Then see the failure by the king to assume the leadership of the revolution. The king should have taken a step to contain this revolution, at least using the army. For example, at the point when the revolutionaries came, and when the king called the Estates General Meeting, that was the point when the king should have contained the revolution, because he had a chance to meet all the demands of the three groups of people, and he did not manage to do that. Or perhaps he shouldn't even have called for that Estates General Meeting, because he did not foresee that bringing these three estates together is going to make them become rowdy. So the king failed, and the revolution succeeded. And then his failure to accept the reforms brought by the revolutionaries. It's important to remember that the revolutionaries only needed change. The revolutionaries did not have any trouble with the king. The revolutionaries expected the king to accept some of their proposals, but the king remained adamant. The king remained very negative. For example, when they proposed the civil constitution of the clergy, and the king rejected it because he was a staunch Catholic, and other errors that the king made. So again, the king, in that way, he made the revolution to succeed. He allowed the revolution to come from the bottom rather than from the top. The persistent insolvency of the Bourbon monarchy is also what made the revolution to succeed. In other words, the monarchy was broke. The monarchy did not have money, and therefore containing a revolution was just an impossible dream. So because of that, the revolution inevitably did what? it succeeded. Then we have other factors here. For example, the self-conversion of the third estate into the National Assembly. I think this happened after the calling of the estate's general meeting. During the what? During the tennis court oath, when the peasants now said they would not disperse until an assembly or a parliament was established. So the king should have contained that. But remember, the king was very adamant. The king was very ignorant. The king didn't know what to do. The revolution was in progress, and therefore it ended up succeeding. Once the third estate declared themselves into the National Assembly, the success of the revolution was now within the vicinity. Then you have the support the revolutionaries gave, or the support the revolutionaries got from the masses. It's important to remember that the peasants supported the revolution in various ways. It's also important to recall that without the support of the masses, the revolution would have surely failed. But this revolution was greatly supported by the majority of the people in France. Then there was, of course, support from the army. The army supported the revolutionaries. The army gave support to the revolutionaries in a number of ways. For example, if you remember, during the march to Versailles, when Lafayette took charge of the security of the women who were taking a petition to the king, that shows you that the army was in support of the French Revolution, because Lafayette by then was a general in the army. Then the unfortunate death of Mirabeau. We all know that Mirabeau was a personal friend to the king, but we also know that he was a sympathizer to the peasants and the revolutionaries. So when Mirabeau died, the king lost a good advisor, and so that made the king to make so many errors. But also the revolutionaries lost a sympathizer and someone who would guide them. And therefore, after the death of Mirabeau, the revolution became very, very radical. The revolution became very, very chaotic, and there was a lot of bloodshed. And then because of that, the revolution was progressing in the right direction without Mirabeau. Then the insensitivity of the aristocracy in France. The aristocracy here, we are talking about the monarchy. We are talking about the king and his group. They failed to provide practical solutions to the problems of the people of France. Whereas it is true that the people of France did not want trouble with the king, it is also important to remember that when the people of France saw that the king and his people were not in position to give any practical solutions to their problems, they became chaotic. They became very, very chaotic, and eventually the revolution succeeded because these people now adopted radical means. They started using force, and that explains why the reign of terror became inevitable. But whereas there was a lot of bloodshed, there was progress in the revolution. And eventually, by the end of it, there was a complete change in France. Then we have the leadership of the revolution. I think we all know how the different people led the revolution at different stages. We know the role played by Mirabeau, Count Mirabeau, in the first stage of the revolution. Then, of course, we know the role played by Maximilien Robespierre in the second phase of the revolution. And then we know the different leaders who came during the Directorate government. So in other words, These leaders provided direction. These leaders provided guidance. These leaders mobilized the people. And that is partly why the revolution succeeded in France. Then we have other factors. Let me see. The creation of the National Guard. Okay, just a minute. Yeah, just 1 minute. Yeah, persistent insolvency. Then we have here the creation of the National Guard under Lafayette led to the preservation of the rights and achievements of the masses. Yes, the National Guard was created to replace the Royal Guard, and it was now the Revolutionary Army. But most importantly, the National Guard now worked hand in hand with the revolutionaries to make sure that the revolution progresses in the right direction. Then there's that one, the March of Women to Versailles. It is true that the revolution was involving women, so they also took part of the revolution in the revolution. So we are saying that the revolution succeeded because even the women were a part of it. For example, during their march to Versailles, then you see the influence of England, where there were all sorts of freedoms. In other words, the people of France were revolting with the reference to England. They wanted to be free like the people of England. The influence of the American War of Independence. It's important to recall that the Americans were revolting partly because their tax was increased by £1. But when the French troops went to America to help the Americans, they discovered that they are paying a lot many taxes. So there was inspiration coming from the American War of Independence. There was also inspiration coming from England. And in the end, the revolution succeeded. Then you have the influence of the philosophers. It is true these philosophers wrote books. There are so many writings that reminded the people of France of their misery. If you remember the writings of Montesquieu, the writings of Voltaire, and the writings of other writers, that is partly what inspired the French people to revolt, and that is partly where they got the energy. That's partly why the revolution also succeeded. Then the king's unfortunate flight to Venice. The king's attempt to escape to go to Austria before he was intercepted at Venice. That was unfortunate. It exposed the king as a traitor. It exposed the king as a weak character. And when he was brought back amidst humiliation, very many people in France lost confidence in him. And very many people now wanted him to be tried because he was trying to run away from the problems he had caused. And therefore, because of that, also the revolution indeed succeeded. Then you have the king's flight to Venice. We have talked about that. The use of violence during the reign of terror. From 1792, when the law of suspect was issued, very many people were executed because they were suspected to be enemies of the revolution. So because a lot of force was used, very many people escaped to exile, and therefore the revolution succeeded easily back here because people who were targeted were already running away. Then you have the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the Republic in France in 1792. Once France was declared a republic, now it was clear that the monarchy was overthrown. It was also clear that the king had lost everything. And finally, when the king was executed in 1792 and 1793, January 1793, the monarchy collapsed, the revolution succeeded, and life changed for everybody in France, but also around France. So the French Revolution succeeded because of those reasons. Is there any question that somebody wants to ask about the French Revolution before we proceed? Any question? If you have a question, please feel free to post your question on the chat, or you can show your hand if you have anything you want to say. You can lift up your hand such that I can choose you, and then you say what you want to say. Okay, so let us go to number 4. To what extent was nationalism responsible for turmoil in the Balkans between 1821 to 1832? If I may ask, that question number 4, if you look at it, it is on which topic? Which topic is that? 1821 to 1832, yes?
It's the Greek War of Independence.
Exactly, the Greek War of Independence. So they're asking to what extent was the issue of nationalism or independence responsible for the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence, because the Greeks were fighting for their independence from 1821, 1832. And it's important to remember that this or that was a nationalistic movement. The Greeks were fighting against the Turks because the Turks were ruling them. And before we look at that, it's important for us to analyze the policies of the Turks on the Greeks. Whereas it is true that the Turks were the majority, the Greeks are known to have been very prosperous compared to the Turks. The Greeks were obviously Christians, they were Orthodox Christians, and the Turks, of course, were Muslims. So many of the policies were forced on the Greeks. And that partly explains why the Greeks later rose up to fight for their independence. So how far was that fight for independence a nationalistic move by the Greeks? If you see the preamble, they are saying candidates are expected to analyze the extent to which nationalism caused the Greek War of Independence of 1821 to 1832, vis-a-vis other factors that also caused the same war. So a clear standpoint is required. Who were the leaders of the Greek War of Independence? Anybody who still remembers the names of the leaders of the Greek War of Independence? Who led the Greeks during this war? There was a man called Capodistrias. There was another one called Alexander Hypsilanti. So these people led the Greeks during their fight for independence. So let's analyze and see how far was this war a nationalistic war. What extent was this war a nationalistic war? So in the core of the question, this is what they want us to write. It was the Greeks were Christians, like I said. All Greece was a Christian state ruled by the Ottomans, who were Muslims. The Greeks revolted against the Sultan of Turkey. Soon, the Greeks of Turkey declared this revolt against the Turks. And it's important for us to remember that the ruler of Turkey by then was called Sultan Muhammad II. That was the ruler of Greece by that time when the war broke out. So how far was it a nationalistic movement or a nationalistic war? You see there? This war was fought for 8 years. The desire for independence was the driving force. The Greeks were not happy with the policies of the Turks. For example, there was growth of nationalism among the Christian races. The Turks were Muslims. So the Christians wanted independence from the Muslims. So if you look at it from the perspective of religion, it becomes a nationalistic movement too. Also, if you look at the oppressive policies of the Turks, where, for example, the Turks would overtax the Greeks because the Greeks were more prosperous and they were doing a lot of business. But the most important thing is that if you look at it from the perspective of the Greeks wanting to get freedom from overtaxation, then again, it becomes a nationalistic movement. Then the Sultan administered Greece according to the Sharia law. And yet the Greeks were Christians. So if the Greeks wanted to become free from the Sharia law, then again, indeed, that makes it a nationalistic what? Movement. Then you see the Muslims looked at the Christians as non-believers who had to be forcefully converted into Islam. So if the Greeks were fighting because they wanted to get free from that forceful conversion to Islam, then again, it becomes a nationalistic movement. Then the Greek got tired. They got sick of mistreatment from the Sultan, the mistreatment from the Muslims, and they revolted because they did not want to remain under that kind of arrangement. So eventually the revolt broke out because of nationalistic feelings among the Greeks. But on the other hand, we have other factors that also caused the war. As you can see them there, all right, something had happened, but let's continue. Let me share this again so that we proceed. Something small that interrupted me. Post disabled participants.
Hi, people.
Hello, just a minute. I'm working on something here very fast.